morning and welcome friends to our meeting on Sundays. This lodge, as all the others distributed all over the world, hold meetings weekly for the discussion of particular topics that is of interest to students of Theosophy, and in that regard it aims to disseminate the true teachings that were brought out in the 19th century and keep it alive. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and lofty to leave any inclination to take part in side issues. The work and its dissemination is based on the fundamental principles of the philosophy of Theosophy, and each student tries to exemplify these principles in their lives for the purpose of a truer realization of the self and a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood, which was one of the objects of the Theosophical movement at that time, and it's still extremely important that we understand that concept, the unity of all life. So the basis among this union among Theosophists is similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching, and for that reason the ULT has no constitution, officers, the sole bond between the associates being that basis. And it requires all as Theosophists who are engaged in the true service of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization, and welcomes all those into its association and to its declared purposes by those who desire to fit themselves by study and otherwise to be the better able to teach and help others. So the true Theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, but belongs to each and all. Today's reading comes from the Dhammapada, and it is called The Path. The best path is the eightfold path. The best of truths are the Four Noble Ones. The best of states is that of detachment, braga. The best of men is the seer. 2. This is the path. No other leads to the pure vision. Enter ye this path, so shall ye confound Mara. 3. Treading this path you will end your suffering. It was shown by me as soon as I learned how the thorns in the flesh are to be removed. 4. You yourself must strive. Buddhas are but signposts. Those who enter the path and discipline themselves are released from the bondage of Mara. 5. Impermanent are all conditioned beings. He who knows this ceases to be in the thrall of grief. This is the path of purity. 6. Full of pain are all conditioned beings. He who knows this ceases to be in the thrall of grief. This is the path of purity. 7. Unsubstantial are all conditioned beings. He who knows this ceases to be in the thrall of grief. This is the path of purity. 8. He who does not rouse himself when it is time to rise, and though young and strong is full of sloth, whose will and thought are weak, that lazy man will not find the path of wisdom. 9. Guarding a speech, controlling mind, not doing wrong with the body, a man keeps the three avenues to action clear, and thus finds the path shown by the wise. 10. From discipline of yoga springs wisdom. From lack of it, there is loss of wisdom. Knowing this twofold path of progress and decline Let a man bend his way to the path of progress. 11. Cut down the whole forest of desire, not single trees. Danger lurks in the forest. Having cut down trees and uprooted the weeds of desire, you are free, O bhikkhus. 12. So long as the desire, however small, of a man for woman is not destroyed, so long his mind clings like a suckling calf to its mother. 13. Cut out the love of self, as you would an autumn lily. Then resort to the path of peace, to nirvana. The happy one has shown this. 14. Here shall I pass the monsoon, there shall I dwell in winter and summer. This is foolish reflection. He does not consider obstacles of existence. 15. Flood carries off a sleeping village. Death comes and carries off the man absorbed in cattle and children. He is distracted of mind. 16. Sons are no protection for father nor kinsman when one is seized by death. There is no help from relations when death seizes one. 17. Recognizing the significance of this, a wise and good man should straightway begin to clear the path that leads to nirvana. And now today's talk, the origin of genius.
Welcome, friends. HPB has an article on genius, and the topic comes up in many places in Theosophy, in the modern writings, but you have to look for it and find it. They're like little gems hidden. HPB talks about genius. First we'll define what Theosophy considers genius, and then what's involved in genius, what the principles are, how it's possible to become a genius, since we're all on the path of becoming. So Madame Blavatsky says that there is true genius and artificial. So when she's talking about genius, she means true genius, and we'll explain what it is. She says the philosophers of old were nearer the truth than the moderns when they said that man was endowed with a tutelar deity, a spirit whom they called genius. The substance of this entity, to say nothing of its essence, and the presence of both manifests itself according to the organism of the person it informs. Shakespeare says of the genius of great men, what we perceive of his substance is not here. That gives us some idea. And what's involved in genius is truly the mystery of the mind. And in the days of old, it was called a gift of heaven. But Madame Blavatsky says it is due to no chance. It's not a gift from some outside agency. The flame of genius, she says, is lit by no anthropomorphic hand, save that of one's own spirit, with a capital S. And all of us being sort of on the level of spirit, one and the same, truly is accessible to all of us at that level. It is the very nature of the spiritual entity itself, of our ego, which keeps on weaving new threads in the web of reincarnation, on the loom of time, from the beginning to the end of the great life cycle. So to talk a little bit about spirit, she says, no ego differs from any other. This is to establish that we're all the same at this this highest level. So no ego differs from any other in its primordial or original essence and nature. That which makes one mortal a great man and another a vulgar silly person is, as said, the quality and makeup of the physical shell or the casing, and the adequacy or inadequacy of the body and brain to transmit and give expression to the light of the real inner man, and his aptness or inaptness in its turn is the result of karma. So she's talking about the ego, the inner man. Physical man is but the instrument, the musical instrument of the ego, which is the performing artist, she says. And the harmony, when the two come together, so the skill of the instrument, the physical body, no skill can awaken a faultless harmony out of a broken or badly made instrument. The harmony depends on the fidelity, which is an interesting choice of words, fidelity suggesting loyalty, of the transmission by word or act to the objective plane of the unspoken divine thought in the very depths of man's inner nature. Physical man may be like a priceless Stradivarius or a cheap cracked fiddle, or again a mediocrity between the two. But so true genius is at this level of spirit, but it also can only be expressed through an instrument that is loyal or faithful to the whisperings of the inner ego. It suggests that, like she said, that the physical vehicle could be like a cracked fiddle, but then genius would not be able to express itself on this plane. So occultism, what does occultism teach? She says, it teaches that the presence in man of various creative powers, and here by creative powers she's talking about inner sight, the inner hearing, the spiritual senses, which she calls genius and their collectivity, is due to no blind chance and to no innate qualities through hereditary tendencies. And that we know, like Mozart's offspring weren't musical geniuses like he was, Shakespeare's offspring weren't literary geniuses such as he was. But to an accumulation of individual antecedent experiences of the ego in its preceding life and lives. For though omniscient in its essence and nature, it still requires through its personalities of the things of the earth, earthy on the objective plane, in order to apply the fruition of that abstract omniscience to them. So the cultivation of certain aptitudes throughout a long series of past incarnations must finally culminate in one life in a blooming forth of genius in one direction or another. So we'll talk more about it, but that's the idea of true genius. On the other hand, artificial genius, so often confused with the former, is but the outcome of long studies and training, and will never be more than, so to say, the flame of a lamp burning outside the portal of the fane. It may throw a long trail of light across the road, but it leaves the inside of the building in darkness. And as every faculty and property in nature is dual, each may be used to serve two ends, evil as well as good. So will artificial genius betray itself. Born out of the chaos of terrestrial sensations, of perceptive and retentive faculties, like the physical senses, the memory, born out of this chaos, yet of finite memory, it will remain the slave of the body. In other words, so when that body passes away, that flowering will pass away with it. The body, owing to its unreliability and the natural tendency of matter towards confusion, will not fail to lead even the greatest genius, so-called, back into its own primordial element, which is chaos or evil on earth. So this is, this true genius is really a marriage of the spirit and the instrument. Spirit through the instrument, the lower principles in man. And we'll just say it expresses itself through the lower principles. And those that have cultivated spiritual pursuits, practices, lifetime over lifetime, and have developed mind towards its higher, towards spirit, eventually will flower a genius. So this involves reincarnation, not always, which we'll get to in a second. This involves reincarnation as we gradually, life after life, develop our instruments and align our tendencies so that there is this conjunction between spirit and mind and the lower principles. Whereas this artificial genius, true, there is reincarnation, but it only involves the lower principles. And it might be the tendency of someone along a scientific line to, over many lifetimes, there will be a definite development, there will be a definite flowering, but it doesn't have anything to do, it hasn't allied itself with the inner ego and the spirit, and thus she says it will ever turns towards the earthly, which is chaos and, she says evil, because it's not, it can be bent towards terrestrial purposes all too easily because it's not in conjunction with spirit. So what is this conjunction? To say just spirit is kind of abstract and maybe not precise enough. We know that the higher principles are the Atma Buddhi Manas. The Atma shines its light at all times, in all places. There's no atom, there's no point in time or space which is absent from this. And its vehicle, the spiritual soul, is buddhi. And it can express itself through manas, the mind, the thinker. But we know manas is dual in higher and lower. We know manas is dual in the expression of the human being. There's that manas which tends down towards the animal, and there is that manas, that part of his mind, our minds, that tends towards buddhi. And when these two are conjoined, the marriage between manas and buddhi, then we have genius, true genius, because it is accessing the light of the higher principles. And so that's in a nutshell, but we'll talk more about it. But higher, higher mind, eventually, this is here all the time, and she says that the true genius would be someone like, who has this permanent marriage between the higher principles, would be like Jesus or Buddha. the rest, even the most scientifically brilliant person on earth, who may have cultivated those scientific instincts for lifetimes, still is not true genius, but artificial genius. So, because the permanent ego, the reincarnating ego, the higher principles cannot die, that is why true genius is so very rare. This person named Lavateur, I don't know who they are, but they were in HBB's time period, calculated the proportion of genius in general to the everyday person is like 1 to 1 million. But that genius without tyranny, without pretension, that judges the weak with equity, the superior with humanity, and equals with justice is like 1 in 10 millions. And that was Lavateur speaking. And she says this is interesting because it's not very complimentary of human nature. And she said he had in mind this higher sort of intellect. He was talking about 1 in 10 millions, but that was really artificial genius. She says the higher sort is not the genius he was speaking of. And she says it's so much more rare that it's the flowering of like a Mahatma or an adept, someone like Jesus or Buddha. Those are what are called truly developed genius. No man endowed with true genius can ever give way to physical animal passions. In the view of a humble occultist, only such a grand altruistic character as that of a Buddha or Jesus and of their few close imitators can be regarded in our historical cycle as a fully developed genius. And then she talks more in that article about does society help humanity towards the development along this line, or does it really help us along the line of this? And we can probably all answer those questions for ourselves. But more about mind and how, with this marriage, so to speak, of the higher principles and how it relates to true genius. So mind, if we're talking about the lower mind, that, the intellectual, that which tend towards animalistic tendencies, it sort of has, I guess we could say, like a glass ceiling, so to speak. But what's interesting about manas in general as a principle is that it retains all the impressions of a lifetime, and sometimes can strangely exhibit them. Like some people, she gives the example, who could talk in other languages in their sleep, or under trance, or under induced states. And that has to do with the brain and the memory, that it was able to, access some memories of maybe a past life. And while that happens pretty rarely, manas in general retains all impressions, and there are the examples of those who can access it periodically under unusual circumstances. But those who can access all the impressions of one's life, because we might not remember what we did last Tuesday, even though the brain recorded it, having access to those, and furthermore the higher states of the spiritual soul, and the inner sight, the inner vision, the memory of past lives is quite a different thing altogether. But yet, manas retains all impressions of the life we're in now. We could say the lower mind retains all the impressions in the brain, because the brain is the sort of the vehicle of mind. But where the higher impressions are stored, the progress from life to life, the aspirations of the reincarnating ego from life to life, all the very best and highest are not accessible. They aren't recorded in the brain. They are accessible if one awakens the higher centers within the brain, so to speak. The lower mind interferes with the action of higher mind, because just at the present point of evolution, desire and the corresponding faculties and senses are highly developed, and it obscures the spiritual side of manas. It is tinted by each object presented to it, whether it be a thought object or a material object. So lower manas operating through the brain is at once altered into the shape and the other characteristics of the object it's cognizing, whether it's mental or a physical object or whatever. So this causes lower mind to have four qualities. The first one is it naturally flies off to from any point, object, or subject. The lower mind tends to, flit around. The second is that it flies off to some pleasant idea. The third is that it flies off to an unpleasant idea. And the fourth is that it can be in a state of total quiescence, sort of passiveness. What causes it to fly off is due to memory, because memories and things flash in the mind, and you remember this, we remember that, whatever. So that's due to memory, which is also part of lower mind. The second and third are due to memory alone, flying off to a pleasant or an unpleasant object. And the fourth signifies sleep, basically when it's totally quiescent. And these mental characteristics belong to the lower manas, and they are those which the higher manas, aided by buddhi and atma, has to fight and conquer. Higher manas, if able to act, becomes what we sometimes call genius. If completely a master, then it says one becomes as a god. And Theosophy talks about the natural evolution from that the next stage after the man stage is the god stage. And below man is the animal, of course. So once the higher mind is fully active and can access spiritual soul, one becomes a god, and then any information is available to it. Having spiritual sight, understanding the correlations of all the electromagnetic spectrum of colors, sounds, everything's like an open book. The yogi or the one who has achieved this union can inquire into any subject and know everything there is to know about it. As Patanjali says, they can know what's going on in the mind of an ant. So the idea is to awaken these powers, faculties, and senses to develop them. And we don't want to rush into that because it's like a whole new world. It would be like sending a preschooler, plunking them down in the middle of New York City and expecting them to be able to navigate their way out. We need a guide at that point. And the guide, it says when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And that would be like a Mahatma or a master. Once we've developed as much as we can on our own, then we receive the aid of those who have already gone through this path. So the Atma is the higher self, and buddhi, when thoroughly united with manas, may be called the divine ego. So God, divine ego. Makes sense? as we know, at present day, Manas is not fully active in the race because desire is still uppermost. In the next cycle of the human period, Manas will be fully active and developed in the entire race. But that's not going to occur unless everyone uses self-induced and self-devised efforts, Theosophy says. It's not going to happen just by us just waiting for the passage of time, many lifetimes away, that at the human stage, natural impulse, it needs to be aided by self-induced and self-devised effort. That, instinct can take us so far, but then we have to effect this ourselves. And she says at that point, far off in the next cycle of the human period, when Manas is lit, that all beings, all people will have to choose whether they choose to continue evolution in the right-hand path towards the higher, or whether they choose the left-hand path and stay towards the animalistic. Covered a lot of this. Oh, so just to touch on the idea of memory, because we talked about the qualities of the lower mind and how they can fly off and how they're related to the lower mind. Real memory, it depends on the orderly functioning of the physical brain, otherwise it can't be expressed. And there are certain forms of memory known as remembrance and recollection, which require a correctly functioning instrument, a brain. Remembrance, not all the particulars are brought forth, but some feeling of the event or circumstance of the past. Recollection is something we collect back from one point to all other points connected with it. But a third characteristic is reminiscence, and this isn't dependent on the brain. It is brought into function not by any present object that makes us, think of it, but it springs direct from the soul itself. It is direct perception of truth. And it comes from something behind the brain serving as a sort of filter or a translator of those impressions. And that's what she also calls true memory, the possession of the knowledge of the past. It is the memory which connects us physically with the body through all the changes of body, including different lifetimes, scene and circumstance. Without it, we should be living merely from impression to impression. There would be no connection whatever with the past, and there would be no sense of self-identity. Memory exists also in the inner departments of our nature, because every cell in our body has its own memory, so to speak. So to recover the whole memory, to make that great knowledge of the past usable here and now in the brain that we have and in the body, is the true work of quote-unquote salvation. In other words, lifting us out of the earthly and into the spiritual. Only when we understand what we really are shall we be able to take a conscious, active, purposeful part in the evolution of our race. Only when we gain the perception that we are the eternal spirit and death never touches us at all, that we may have a conscious life in spirit and not in matter, only when we begin to think and act from that basis can true memory come through to the brain. Only then can we know for ourselves, have nothing to ask anyone, but have everything to give to every other one. That true memory is possible for every living being. Okay, I think we'll end it there, and maybe some of the rest can come out with questions, like the storehouse of thought, and so forth. So that's the origin of genius. It's within all of us when we consider the higher principles, and it's our job to job. I don't like that word. It's our goal. It's our privilege to be able to access those through training the mind and the faculties.
How is this genius related to Aristotle's genius, which he believed hovers about him, or more or less outside, I guess?
Perhaps that's referring to what HPB said that the ancients called a tutelary deity, but it's not really a being outside of oneself. Maybe, perhaps, the student is thinking that because impressions will come into the brain, that it seemed like it was outside, but that suggests to this student that it wasn't truly a direct perception of truth, undoubted, able to read all departments of nature like an open book. Highly developed and flowering for sure, but maybe not permanent, whereas once this conjunction of manas and buddhi occurs, that's a permanent uniting. I guess one could think of maybe the example of two metals when fused become something else greater than the sum of their parts. It's not, whereas this is maybe a metal that approaches the fused one but isn't quite there. It's not that something different. It's still susceptible to, rust or degradation. Whereas this fused one, if we could think of it as being free from the possibility of being reduced or subject to impurity.
Thank you for a wonderful exposition. At times inspirational, calling us to our higher nature. I'm curious about the connection between the movement from lower manas to higher manas and the achievement of divine ego through the union of manas with buddhi and letting Atma's light shine through, with the levels of initiation which can occur once a master contacts an aspirant, let's say, and helps to take them. They don't do it in one step, right? I mean, there's several steps along the way. This presentation sounded like almost kind of
instantaneous?
One step, so as opposed to multiple steps along the way. I mean, does the process of initiation enter into this sort of path to achievement of divine ego and genius? I assume it does.
Yes. Does initiation play into the part of the conjoining of buddhi and manas over steps instead of all at once, is the gist of your question. Yes, this was a brief overview. Quickly answer, yes, of course. It would take probably a lot more time and volumes to explain how it all occurs. But once one is initiated, it sounds like from the readings there is more of a glimpse into these higher inner realms, and that exploration those realms is guided by a master. Now, he or she cannot push or pull, but only guide. And there are stages, and it is considered a ladder of being, becoming. A god is not made, but he becomes, it is said. So, yeah, some of the Eastern philosophies, Hinduism and Buddhism, one might find more, perhaps, details or bits about those different levels, but unless one knows how to put them in the right order and perspective, they might sound fantastical or, attractive, but one has to understand that it's a narrow pathway, because as soon as one commits to trying to switch direction to just the higher, the lower it will react. It's like when one exercises, commits to a program, it takes time to develop the muscles, and at first one is exhausted and it's difficult, but it gets easier the more one does it. So the idea is that the more we direct our thought and intention towards universality, towards charity, towards those ideas, and the continuity of maintaining those, the more there will be, the lower nature will, react, but one has to sort of, be firm, but also it's said that help comes when we expect it the least. So the higher nature, being aware of all that is going on, will come to one's aid, as will perhaps a teacher, a Mahatma, who, at least the Theosophical masters say, they ever keep their eye on individuals and offer as much assistance as is possible. But one has to take a step towards them before they can take a step towards us. They're only permitted to help so much. As was said, they cannot push or pull. But certainly it sounds like from HPB's writings and from religions around the world that there are levels of initiation. What exactly each level is and what it confers, the student does not know. But certainly it seems like those are times when there is a greater opening, a birth to a new higher plane of perception and activity available. You want to add to that?
No, I was just saying that this phase that you described is the culmination of that effort.
Mm-hmm.
You have been working towards it maybe over many lifetimes, and in that particular lifetime then you are what you have described on that board. When buddhi manas is yoked together, then you have the permanency of that mind, and you remember all of your lives before that you have lived. Not only the information is recorded and you have access to it, but the mind is a general principle, so you have access to the field of the mind, chitti. So it becomes, I think the statement is that you hold life and death in your strong hand. So that statement shows that this purification process that is described in theosophical literature is a preliminary, it's a necessity, that until you drop all those off through your own self-devised, self-induced effort, no master can appear. But when you prepare the soil, then it does.
And just to add to that, even when one reaches that level of the yoking and the initiation, one still has an amount of karma still to be expended from so many previous lives. So it still requires one to, resolve that karma. And in some of the Buddhist teachings, it's thought that one does this for the sake of all others, because then one can better aid others. And in fact, it says, Buddha says that not only is it, so to speak, necessary, but it's urgent. Which is really sort of mind-blowing, that obtaining a human form is difficult, and that trying to save all beings from the pain of repeated uncontrollable rebirth, impelled rebirth, is urgent.
And that's right in the Declaration too, the way I understand the Declaration, because it says the reason why we're going through all this is to try to learn to help and teach others. We have to improve ourselves in order to do that, which gets to the question of, you mentioned that we have to get rid of our lower selfish tendencies and other tendencies, the fear and anger and all that, before the master is in a position to appear. I guess my question is the master there all the time? Are the masters around observing all of this activity and maybe focusing most as they see individuals coming along? Is that
Absolutely.
So they're in the background to try to help us all the time.
Yeah, and when one does this, one generates the seed of enlightenment. I'll just give a capital E. It's called bodhicitta. I don't know if I'm spelling it correctly. Bodhicitta, the seed of enlightenment. And it has to flower.
Light. It's light that is visible to the ones who can see you internally. So when they see that light lighted, that's when they come to your aid. We don't see it, we don't know. But when it is there, I think it's called the star of initiation. They see it. But at that stage, I think you are selfless. You have reached selflessness because you're for the benefit of all, as you said. Selfishness drops, materiality drops, all of the characteristics that we hold so dear, all of them drop. You become light itself, is a statement.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when the lotus appears, I think, in that analogy. The lotus appears on top of the water.
I guess it's said that, the Buddha says we've reincarnated so many times that every person we meet has been our mother. And if we truly considered every other being as our mother, would we want to see her impelled to incarnate against her will in painful circumstances repeatedly? No, we would do what we could to aid her. I mean, she protected us when we weren't aware. Her every thought was for our safety. That kind of self-sacrificing devotion, but on behalf of all beings, is what is required. Which
So distinguishing
Cool.
between if us distinguishing between the true genius and the artificial genius, the only way we can do that is, I guess, within ourselves and recognize whether we have that selfish tendency or not, because that selfish tendency will remain in the artificial genius. Is that correct?
yeah.
Just
And instead of
camouflaged.
yes, exactly. It's still lurking under the surface, and it could, if attention is turned away, it could sprout again and undo all the effort over lifetimes that was put into it. Had another thought that just left my mind.
Still personal. There's personality involved there because the intellectual mind and personality go together. Materiality, personality, selfishness is still there.
Mm-hmm. And if it exists even in
Germ.
the seed, in germ, even in the race at large, if one hasn't conquered those in oneself, then one is also subject to them. That seed isn't the property of someone else and not this individuality. We all share the karma of each is the karma of all, so to speak. And Theosophy says it is easier to eradicate selfish tendencies not by focusing on them, like I'm not going to be selfish, I'm not going to be this, but by cultivating the virtues. And then the selfishness will drop away, the earthly tendencies will just drop away if we focus on cultivating the virtues of selflessness, so forth and so on.
So that is not an easy thing to do, because we have a
If it was easy,
human
we would have all
tendency to
done
be
it by
selfish,
now.
and in the animal kingdoms, if you will, we talk about them having perfect, if you will. Well, it's not instinct. It's instinct in the animal, I guess. Within their mode of operation, but it's a bit selfish too with the animals. That's I guess the difference between instinct and intuition, if you will.
But it's said that even animals in the forest have recognized, even ferocious animals have recognized the presence of a master and don't attack. Like they perceive even
Harmlessness.
exactly,
Harmlessness.
and they know.
That's
Whereas with our intellectual mind, we might be thinking, what's their motive and all this stuff, and sort of miss the obvious.
Well, there's a PBS show. It shows a animal handler. He was raised. The lions recognized him as being in their best interest, if you will, and he is out in the landscape, and the lion appears from the bush and runs after him and comes to play with him.
It's pretty neat.
Yeah.
But one statement that was made was that animals are selfish, but no, they're not selfish. They only take what they need. Animals are not selfish. They do it by instinct, and survival is their aim.
That's why there's all those Jataka tales of the Buddha, as being an animal, and showing that the animal's self-sacrifice, laying down his life for the lion
with the cubs.
to eat. So I just want to add that the idea of soul represents the acquired experience gained through evolution by each and every class of being. And that's why when this soul and mind are conjoined, we have such a vast horizon? I don't even want to say horizon because that suggests it has an end.
Wisdom?
Yeah, because it's by each and every class
Knowledge.
of being.
Knowledge.
It becomes perfect knowledge, direct perception of truth, reminiscence. We have forgotten, as the Mahatmas say, we have forgotten that we are gods. But once it is active, we remember. We have access to those memories of what we once were.
Well, there was once, this reminds us that of like the ancient third eye and all that many eons ago. Now we've lost that. And so I guess the question is, there's parts of the brain that are rather spiritual and others that are, but the spiritual, I guess, is throughout. I don't know how that would work.
Yeah, she says the third eye atrophied because of misuse. Sort of use it or lose it, and it was lost through misuse and towards selfish ends. so it gradually became obscured, and now it's no longer visible. But there is a remnant in the brain of visual center, the third eye, the pineal gland. So, yeah. So next week is Patanjali's Yoga Aphorisms,
Right.
and we have a roundtable discussion of living the life today after a short break.
Thank you.